Anyway, so welcome again to the December meeting, and it is we have been having the September, October, and now the December meetings have kind of looked at the Earth from afar and from a distance in time. So we started out with a talk on the solar system and why the planet Earth was, especially well situated for the evolution of life. And then we had a geology presentation from where we heard about the last, I think it was 1 billion years. And today we're going to hear about fossils. And it is a great pleasure that Jade Atkins, who is the new director and curator of paleontology at the Joggins Institute in Joggins. And Jade studied the evolution and development of the fossil record using both fossils and living organisms to learn how amphibians and early amniotes changed and grew during their lifetimes. So without further ado, Jade, take it away.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, I don't know how I can follow the solar system, but I'm going to do my best. So I will share my screen. I like to start every talk I do with a land acknowledgement. So Joggins is located in Sikvik, which is one of the 7 mainland districts here in Mi'kma'ki. So I will share that with you. And everybody can see just fine?
Yeah, looks good.
Perfect. All right. So we're going to talk about a 300 million year old story. So we're going to talk about the Joggins fossil cliffs. We're going to talk about how life was in Nova Scotia during the Carboniferous using research that has taken place at the Joggins fossil cliffs. So I start every talk with my background and how I came into paleontology. I like to do that because most of my talks are for university students or high school students, and I have had a bit of a weird trajectory, and I'm the first person in my family to go to university. So as a first-gen person, I like to share where I've come from and where I've gone, in hopes that other people at the start of their career will be able to have a better understanding of how it doesn't have to just be like a straight trajectory. We can take side quests and go on little side routes. So I grew up in Pictou, which is marked here on the map. And I come from the same hometown as Sir William Dawson, who you might recognize as one of, he's here in this picture with me. He's one of the first people from a Western perspective to really study Joggins and encourage other people to study Joggins. Like me, he was a first-generation university student. He was the parent of 2 immigrants. My dad is an immigrant. So he was first gen in more than one way, but I always think it's really cool that I'm now at Joggins, which is a place that he loved and studied and researched for years and years. And we come from the same hometown and have had very similar career trajectories. I was not really interested in the outdoors as a kid. I'm the oldest of 4. I have 3 younger brothers. And my middle younger brother, Zach, who's shown here in the red shorts, was our family's naturalist. He was always going out and looking for salamanders and frogs. And we'd go to the beach and he'd find so many animals. Like he was always collecting the jellyfish and the crabs that he could find. This was a skate that just like happened to wash up on the shore. And he was so proud of this find and really didn't want to leave it behind. So my parents snapped a picture, so we would always have that memory. I actually wanted to be a doctor when I went to university. And it wasn't until I took an evolution course in my 3rd year that I realized that maybe I had other things that were more fascinating to me than medical school. So I started off working with living animals. I studied the development of the lower jaw in zebrafish. So I wasn't always interested in paleontology, and I wasn't always interested in animals, really. I wanted to use animals and fossils to learn about evolution. So I did a master's on squamates, and I studied eye bones that are present in most squamates, but not in some. And I looked into why it was present in some and not others by looking a little bit at the fossil record. But then I did a PhD where I fell in love with Joggins and with fossils. So my PhD was studying how animals change, especially amphibians and early amniotes, from their eggs through to adults, and how that has changed. And it turns out there are some things that we have collected and we share with our fossil ancestors and with all tetrapods. So these are land animals like us, other mammals, birds, uh, other reptiles like squamates, so lizards and amphibians. There are things that are homologous from all of us, but then there are things that we have collected as we have evolved into our separate lineages. So I've been really interested in what has been happening with amphibians. So to do that, I had to look at the fossil record. This is me at Magwasha. I've also done field work at Joggins, and combine that with morphological work. So this is an axolotl with the bone and cartilage stained, and then with some genetic work. So I actually did get to work in the lab while also doing fossil work. And all of that combined together into a pretty unique PhD, and has led me to the Joggins Fossil Institute today. But I know that you're here for an even older story. It's actually my birthday tomorrow, so I'm feeling a little old. And but whenever I think about the Joggins fossil cliffs, I know that I can't be that old because they are 300 million years old. So we call the Carboniferous the age of the coal. And it was from around 360, 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago, which is just unfathomable. It's just such a large scale. In comparison, humans have been around for 100,000, 150,000 years, like hominids, 5 million years. The mastodon that you can go see currently at the Nova Scotia Museum is 80,000 years old, and this is even older. And so, as you would expect, things were pretty different back then. Terrestrial life was just kind of starting to be established in what we would consider modern like. So, terrestrial life had become established, they were diverging into lineages that we can recognize as still existing today. So, we have the amniotes, which are the animals that can lay eggs away from water. We have amphibians, insects were already well established by then, but tetrapods were present. And the Carboniferous is marked by cyclotherms, which is not something that we have today because you have to look on a scale of millions to see cyclotherms. But basically, what was happening is as the seas would come onto land or regress and come away from land, you would have flooding and marine sediment being deposited, and then that would be the cycle would be the marine that would be present, and then it would go to a more dry terrestrial land, and then this would cycle for millions and millions of years. And it's one of the things that really helped the age of coal to come along when there was not ocean everywhere on the coast. We would have wet, humid environments that would result in these swampy forests, like in this reconstruction by Mary Evans, with these giant fern trees. So we call them lycospid trees, and they are huge. And so think of the ferns that you see when you go into the forest, but 10, 15, 20 feet tall with, trunks that were just so big. And these were the trees that were present. We didn't have any angiosperms, so like the birch trees or the oak trees or maple trees, and gymnotherms, conifers, were quite rare until later on in the Carboniferous. In the late Carboniferous, which is where Joggins is situated, we did have the first amniotes present. So again, these are the animals that can lay eggs outside of water. So birds, reptiles, us. Towards the end of the Carboniferous, we had the formation of Pangaea, which is the supercontinent where all the continents collided together. And because Pangaea was forming, we had lower sea levels, there was mountain building activity, and we had a transition to cooler, drier environments. The Permian was quite cool and dry compared to the humid, swampy Carboniferous. And this looked more like what we see in this reconstruction by John Seelig, where we have, it seems less humid. It's more like a drier forest that we would be able to go into today. And in this environment, in the late Carboniferous, is where all of these early modern ecosystems were starting to take hold, and we're starting to evolve and become present. And we had, carnivores, herbivores, fish, all of these things were represented back in the Carboniferous. Now, Nova Scotia in the Carboniferous was equatorial. So it's the red dot on here. We had the dense and swampy forests. They were the tropical rainforests that you might see in the Amazon today. And we had the cycling that you see worldwide. So we had the humid, arid, humid cycling. There was regular flooding that then would become dry, and we had regular forest fires too, likely as a result to the higher oxygen levels in the atmosphere. The Carboniferous had the highest oxygen levels ever recorded. And Nova Scotia also records these cyclotherms that were present throughout Pangaea and the Carboniferous. And of course, this is a great environment for coal formation. So all of these coal mines that we had throughout the early days of present day Nova Scotia, and even when the Acadians were the settlers and the colonizers that were here, all of that is 300 million years old. And without the Carboniferous here, we wouldn't have had this coal, the coal mines or the coal industry. So these coal forests were occurring in swampy areas that had rivers. There were regular flooding that caused a lot of deposition, which is when sediment is laid down. The deposition, in turn, would cause areas to dry out. So after a while, so much sediment, so like sand and clay and other things, would be deposited in such high quantities that the river would dry out. And then forest fires would occur in the dry area, and that would leave behind charcoal that would eventually, after time, become the charcoal, which would then result in coal eventually. And Joggins is not the only Carboniferous site in Nova Scotia, of course. We have basically most of northern Nova Scotia and along the North Shore. If it's not upper Carboniferous, which is late Carboniferous, lower Carboniferous, which is early Carboniferous, it's, Precambrian Devonian with a tiny bit of Triassic, Jurassic here along the Bay of Fundy. Joggins is, of course, up here. So, and you will note that if you look at a map of the coal fields and the coal mines in Nova Scotia, they are virtually the same map. So wherever you have the upper Carboniferous sites, you have these coal fields and then these coal mines. So why do we have all of these great Carboniferous sites? Why do we have the coal mines or the coal fields that have resulted in the coal mines in this rich, industrial history? Well, that is the result of the formation of the Fundy Basin and the Bay of Fundy. So you will note that this is where Nova Scotia is in the Carboniferous. And by the end of the Triassic, 200 million years ago, you can see that there is now water consistently present here. This is a result of a rift formation that caused the Fundy Basin. It's a failed rift, really, and has resulted in some unique geological features. That is why we have the Joggins fossil cliffs today. So I have a very quick video that goes through the splitting of the continents. Nova Scotia is present basically in the middle of the screen for most of it. Let's try to fix this. There is no sound, so you're not supposed to hear sound. And then we've drifted over here as the modern continents as we know them and they've been have started to form. So one of the things that has happened with this failed rifting that occurred as a result of Pangea breaking up. So I say failed because where the rifting occurred, like for certain, is where we have the Atlantic Ocean. So Bay of Fundy represents one of these failed rifting sites that occurred where an ocean like didn't form. And so you might know this since you are in Wolfville, but of course we have mountains in Nova Scotia. I know people from BC and Alberta love to joke that that we don't have mountains, just big hills. Well, technically, from a geological definition, we do have mountains. So we have North Mountain and South Mountain, and they formed in the Triassic, and they helped to form that Bay of Fundy, make that funnel shape. And you actually, if you did do like a geological tour around Wolfville and or in Digby, you would be able to see some of the basalts from this mountain building activity, which I think is really cool. You are in a really excellent area to see that mountain building activity. And then the Bay of Fundy, so it formed because of this failed rift. And then its unique funnel shape has caused what we call a tidal resonance. So the time it takes a wave to travel in and then out of the bay is equal to the time between high and low tides. So that's about six hours, 7 hours. And because of the long periods of time, the tides are amplified and it makes them larger. So that's why the Bay of Fundy has the highest recorded tides in the world. But as a result, deposition and erosion occurs very quickly. So that is both our benefit because it means that the Joggins fossil cliffs is constantly overturning and showing us new fossils, new finds, but it's also bad because it's a race against time. So, you know, erosion along Nova Scotia coast is about 25 centimeters a year. In 1842, when Dawson first visited Joggins, he counted along with his colleagues 14 fossil trees along the Joggins fossil forest section. When I did my seasonal wrap-up count in October of 2022, I found 7. In 2017, I made a map of all the trees I found in the cliff as part of my PhD. Not a single tree was still in the cliff this year. It was an entirely new crop. So every 3 to 4 years, the old trees weather out. So of course, from 2017 to now, that's 5 years, and new trees are visible. About 700 trees have eroded out of the cliffs in the past 180 years. So we have it's good from, like a scientific perspective, because we really love to see the trees and we love to learn from them. But from like the perspective of saving this area, and from like the perspective of saving this UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's not super great, but we do what we can. And of course, so we're going to get into the Joggins environment specifically, because I've kind of taken you through the history of how it has formed and why. Oh, I think I have some feedback there. The Zoom is so great because we all get to like meet here. Like I can come to you from Pictou without having to drive 4 hours. But as I was teaching throughout the whole pandemic online, I also learned that it could get a little like you hear things that you don't always want to hear, or your students like won't go on camera and you're talking to just like these black boxes. I really love Zoom. We have a love-hate relationship though, I think. But yeah, so we're going to talk about the Joggins fossil cliff specifically. So we record 15 million years at Joggins. So from around 318 million years to 303 million years. We are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We have 14.7 kilometers that preserves the most complete late Carboniferous environment worldwide. So there are other Carboniferous sites, especially, it will not surprise you. So we have like the Cape Breton Highlands here. And one of the things that the original Scottish colonizers noted was that the environment here was so similar to the environment back home in Scotland. And of course, they have coal mines in Scotland. And that's because at one point, Scotland and Nova Scotia were connected in the Carboniferous. So there are a lot of Carboniferous animals that are found in Scotland and similar trackways, and all of the coals found there. And that's because we used to be quite connected, and that's why we have the similar geology now. But the Joggins fossil cliffs here has the best and the most complete preservation, and it actually preserves 3 ecosystems. We have the estuarine bays, the floodplain rainforest, and the forested alluvial plains. So I'm going to go through each one. So the estuarine bays would be very similar to what we see in the present day Gulf of St. Lawrence. This is that open water environment that's brackish and marine, and actually is quite interesting because it seemed the fish that lived in the Carboniferous brackish and marine environments were actually pretty well suited to freshwater environments too. Unlike today's fish, which are other than, salmon and a couple of others, it's kind of like, pick one, pick marine, pick freshwater. And there has been some research that has shown that there were these big carnivorous fish that were present that were eating other fish and amphibians and reptiles. So, quite big and quite interesting. So it was a pretty open water environment. It's in this environment that we have fossil bivalves. So the clam coal, which if you've been to Joggins, you may have heard an interpreter talk about, which is all coal pieces and other bivalve pieces that are pretty prevalent on the beach. We had ostracod, which are these really tiny crustaceans that you may have heard called seed shrimp. And they are quite interesting and indicate a marine environment. And they were the former curators, Dr. Melissa Gray's specialty. She studied them quite a bit when she worked at Joggins. We also had gastropods, marine gastropods, not like the land snails I'll talk about later. And we had evidence of fish, both actinopterarians and sarcopterygians. So those are big words. Actinopterarians are like the bony fish, like zebrafish, salmon, teleos fish. And sarcopterygians are actually They are lungfish and coelacanth, but back in the Carboniferous, there were more examples of that. And we have evidence of from their brain cases, so the part of the bone that protects the brain from the elements and from scales. There's also some evidence of sharks at Joggins. Then we had the floodplain rainforest, which similar to today is like the Amazon rainforest. These are very poorly drained environments that had dense forests, stagnant peat mires. So you can imagine it would have been quite smelly and quite wet. It would be very humid, very hot. And this is what people think about when they think about Joggins, because this is where we see the evidence of the Lycopsid forest, so the big forests and the cliffs. And we see the fossil forest preserved in situ. So we have the big tree in the cliffs. This is all from that poorly drained environment. And it's also where we get the coal seams that have made Joggins and other Carboniferous sites famous worldwide. But the forested alluvial plains are much more interesting to me as somebody that is a vertebrate paleontologist. So today it would be like parts of the Wabanaki Forest, which is the forest that covers part of Nova Scotia into Maine and New Brunswick. These are well-drained environments that were, seasonally, you would have high humidity and the rivers would flood. And then the other seasons, it would be quite dry. You would have these alternating rainy and dry seasons like we see right now, right? Like if I went to Keji in the spring, it would be quite wet. I went to Keji in October and it was quite dry, which I hear is rare, but it was a good time, and you would have frequent flooding. And you don't have any coal seams in the forested alluvial plain environment. But what you do have is some of the really amazing tetrapod vertebrate finds that I like to study. So we have the oldest the oldest representative of Temnospondyli, which is an amphibian lineage that likely contains today's frogs and salamanders. So we have the oldest example of an unbroken lineage that goes back, 303 million years in Dendroproton. We also have Calanethalon, which is an amphibian that we call an embolomere, which is just like a type that is an early tetrapod and has a very particular vertebral element. So anything that has a vertebral element like that, we call it an embolomere. This is also where Hylonomus comes from. So this is the earliest record of amniotes, this reptile, Hylonomus, which is of course our provincial fossil. We have a mammalian ancestor present in the well-drained environment. So we have a synapsid, which is part of a lineage that eventually gives rise to amniotes. We have parts of the brain case here and the dermal skull. This is the pineal foramen, which you might recognize if you study bones at all. And we have the famous invertebrates. So Dendropupa is the oldest land snail. And it was actually, Dendropupa is famous because they made it into On the Origin of Species by, of course, Charles Darwin. And we also have Arthropilera, which is my favorite and the favorite of all the children that visit it, because this was a millipede that could grow 6 feet long. Like, no joke, they were huge. All the children love it because a millipede that's 6 feet long is just, we can't imagine it. But the insects got really big in the Carboniferous. So this is the exoskeleton of an Arthropleura. And most of our trace fossils come from these well-drained environments. So for example, this is a Joggins fossil. This has the trackway of an Arthropleura seen here. That was a little big. And then we have a little amphibian crossing the trackway. So, these things were living all together in an environment that was as rich as any environment we would see in present day. And we get the fossilized roots, stigmaria, in the well-drained section, because of course the flooding would kill the trees, and we have some stumps, but mostly roots. And we find a lot of these animals in, so like Dendroperton and Hylonomus in these trunks, because we're still not super sure if they were getting washed in after death as a result of flash flooding, or if they were denning in these sites, so laying eggs, having babies in these sites, or if the third option is perhaps they were hiding in there during the giant forest fires of the Carboniferous and couldn't get out. We're still not super sure. Everybody kind of has their favorite idea. We all like to think of them as denning, though, because it makes for a nicer story, I think. And so this is what that well-drained environment looked like. This is an art piece recently by Danielle Defoe. So you can see that she has Hylonomus denning with its eggs in one of these Lycopsid trees. You can also see some of these insects that we talked about. There's another little Dendroperton, or sorry, Hylonomus over here. And they're hunting and they're, having a good time in a 300 million year old environment. There are, of course, other Carboniferous sites in Nova Scotia that I also love to talk about, because I think that outside of Joggins, Nova Scotia does have a really rich fossil localities that all are bearing and revealing very old behaviors and finds. So, for example, we have the oldest evidence of parental care here in Nova Scotia. So this is Dendromya unamachiensis. So of course, if you know Mi'kmaq, unamachiensis is from Unamaki, which is what we call Cape Breton. And this was a fossil that was found in Florence, I believe, or just outside of Sydney in Cape Breton. So all of Nova Scotia's Carboniferous has really rich stories to tell, and it's really important that we work hard to find these fossils and to learn more about them. So I do want to talk about the history of research at Joggins, more present day research. I want to give a shout out to a colleague of mine, Dr. Tim Fedak. He studies historical geology in Nova Scotia, and he is an amazing resource for historical Joggins and historical research across all of Nova Scotia. So I will just go into like a little bit. So Tim, you should contact him if you're interested in more of the history of Nova Scotian geology. He is at the Nova Scotia Museum. So the sign of the first settler colonizer research was done in the 1800s by Dawson, Logan, and Lyell. Dawson was a local geologist and paleontologist, and he brought two colleagues, Logan, who wanted to map the Joggins fossil cliffs for the newly formed Geological Survey, and Lyell, who brought fossils like Dendropupa back to London, where Darwin studied them and wrote about them in On the Origin of Species. So these three started in the 1800s, and Dawson went on to write 19 papers about the Joggins fossil cliffs that he would often present in London at the Royal Society there. In the 1900s, we had a couple of local people at Joggins who really recognized the uniqueness of this site and wanted to work hard to preserve it. So first was Harry Burke, who ran the Fundy Museum in Joggins throughout the 60s and 70s. And of course, we have Don Reed, who we call the keeper of the cliffs. Don spent his days, his free time as a kid, when he wasn't unfortunately working in the mines due to his father having an injury, combing the beach when he could to look at the Joggins fossils. And prior to the legislation in the early 80s that protected all of Nova Scotia's fossils, Don would collect them. And in the 80s, he actually started a museum in his house. And that is really the first Joggins Fossil Institute. People would come from all over to look at his museum, or to look at his fossils and study them. And he was very instrumental in our UNESCO World Heritage designation. So I just want to give him a shout out. In 2008, we did become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, thanks to the work of several people, including John Reed. And since then, and kind of a little bit before then, people have come to really get to know this site better. So in 2003 and 2011, we started to study more the geological context for Joggins. So, you know, I talked about the dry lands, the wetlands, the open water, estuary, brackish bay. So this is all recorded in the rocks, and we had geologists like Davies and Gibling come and take a look and really learn about these three environments and what we found in each one. And of course, Melissa Gray continued that work when she started at Joggins in 2008. So she mapped the formation on the cliffs. So you can see Joggins, the Fossil Institute is here at Hard Scrabble Point, and that's the Joggins Formation. And then as you walk along the beach, there's older formations and then newer formations as you walk south along the beach. We also have learned a lot from coprolite research. So you might know what this looks like. So this is fossilized poop. And paleontologists use fossilized poop to help us understand better the ecosystems that are present somewhere, and especially at Joggins. And it's from the fossilized poop that we know that the carnivorous fish were present, because there's fish bones in their poop, amphibian bones, invertebrates. And if you look at the poop under a microscope, you can actually see these little bits and pieces that were not properly digested. We have also started to take old discoveries and micro CT scan them. So that creates a digital 3D copy of the fossil, which allows us to see inside the fossil without cutting it up. So this paper on Dendrocraton came out earlier this year. Calinethalon was described during the pandemic. Something that you can do at home, right? So we have these 3D scans that are allowing us to see internal structures in the fossils. I'd like to end with a couple of shout outs. So one of the things that I have started is a virtual seminar series, which is on the second and fourth Thursdays of the month from 1 to 2 p.m. I advertise it over email and social media, and it's where you can come to hear more Joggins Fossil Institute research if you so desire. And of course, we are celebrating our 15-year anniversary in 2023 as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So please look for some any sort of events we might be having. We're planning that in the works, and you can come to the site and hear, you know, more research and see what we've been up to. So yes, I will stop share so I can see all of your lovely faces again.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's always so fascinating for me to hear about all this stuff that occurred in the past and how different, you know, an area was, and it's just astounding. And then, of course, to think what we humans are doing right now, which is basically speeding up time in a sense with our human impact. Anyways, so thank you so much for your presentation. Now, I'm going to go on this view.
Yes, thank you. And it
questions?
is interesting to see how it's similar, right?
Yes.
In some ways, the Nova Scotia climate or at least what would be recorded geologically is pretty similar to what was going on in the Carboniferous at
Yeah.
points.
Fascinating. Are there questions, please?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Of course, yeah.
When you see those large trunks of trees, and you mostly think of sediments as being layer upon layer, with age. How do you correlate the age with the height and with the layers that are laid upon each other?
Oh yeah, it's pretty visceral, right? Because when we learn about, like Steno's laws in geology, one of them is cross-cutting relations. So that something must be present in order for something else to cut it. And of course, the trees are the exception to that rule. So we do tend to ignore the trees because what's happening with the trees is when they died and their stumps were left behind, one of the reasons why we think that they were able to fossilize as these whole stumps is because the insects that were eating, that came along later to eat like the gymnosperms and angiosperms trees hadn't evolved yet. So they were just kind of like hanging out and not being eaten and not being like returned to the soil. And then what was happening is flooding was occurring around them. And so the sediment was building up around them and burying them. And when you look at the Joggins fossil cliffs, the beds are quite thick. So it was quite a lot of sediment being deposited very quickly. And then that was burying the trees, and then erosion might occur. And then, so these trees were taking millions of years to be covered, which is still much faster than what you would think, like, otherwise. But yeah. So sorry, that's a very long way to say that we ignore them when it comes to the dating.
Any other questions? I have another one then. So you mentioned these three different, I think you call them ecosystems: the wet, and the dry, and the other one. What about fossilization of organisms would be different in those three environments, I imagine.
Yes.
How do you how do you compare them, or how do you deal with those three different environments in terms of how fossils are formed?
Ooh, so it's pretty much we get what we get. So of course, in a marine environment, everything is pretty beat up and in pieces, and it's very hard to piece things together. And that's true in all three, really. But the marine environment it's especially beat up. So we haven't found like a full fish skeleton. You find individual scales or a tooth or part of a skull. We would see nothing like that beautiful Dendroproton fossil that I showed you a couple times in the marine environment, which is unfortunate. But as you know, in the ocean, things are getting turned around constantly, and these, whatever was going on in this bay estuary environment, things were not settling down quickly and becoming buried quickly, at least not that we've seen so far.
Right. And what about the dry environments? There wouldn't be a lot of deposition there, I imagine.
No, there wasn't, but there was still flooding, which would cause some deposition.
Okay.
So we think it's these flooding events that are allowing us to see some of these more whole fossils. And you can see that they're still missing things. Dendroproton is the best fossil to come out of Joggins. All it's missing is the distal end of the tail. If you ever have the chance to see the Hylonomus holotype, which is being held at the Museum of Natural History in London. I do not know how Dawson was able to look at that, because at first glance it just looks like crap. And then as you start to look at it, you're like, oh, that's a bone, that's a jaw, that's a jaw, that's also a jaw. Okay. And I think there's like 4 or 5 individuals in this one block, and they are all in pieces. Yeah.
Fascinating, yes.
So you see along the Bay of Fundy and along the Gulf of St. Lawrence at
Okay,
about the same
I'll ask that question.
levels, different fossil remains. Like at Blue Beach, you see, and you see the gypsum, you see the fossils along there. I've been to the fossil sites up at the Chaleur Bay, where all the the fish, all those big fish are. You know,
Yeah,
that,
the rhizodonts, I think you mean.
yes, that's it, yeah,
Yeah.
coelacanths and family
Yeah.
fish. And but they all seem to be from the same level, but they must be from millions of years apart, are they?
Yes, yeah. So they are really interested. So Blue Beach is actually a pretty unique site too. So Blue Beach is from Romer's Gap, which is a gap in the fossil record that was
I
named
met Romer.
you did. Oh my gosh, yeah.
I
So it was
did when
named
I was at
after
University of Toronto. Tom Parsons was a student of
really.
Romer and invited him.
Yeah. And Romer did some research here in Nova Scotia, actually. He would come up and visit when he was at Harvard. So it's named for Romer because he recognized that there's this 30 million period in the Carboniferous where not a lot of fossils are found. And it's unclear if that's like a bias, like a preservational bias. So that would be something that is because like the fossils that were occurring at that time were just not fossilizing for environmental reasons, or if it's a collection bias because not a lot of sites maybe have this 300-million-year-old gap. So that's Blue Beach. And yeah, so they are millions of years apart, but they do look really similar, like the rhizodonts, which are the big sarcopterygian coelacanth-like fish, are present also at Maguasha, which is Devonian, which is the site in Quebec. But they are, of course, like so we see that now. So for example, coelacanths were present also at other Carboniferous sites, and were present in actually they were thought to have gone extinct, and then of course they didn't. So we do see similar body plans spanning millions and millions and millions of years. Not everything were like the dinosaurs, which is like everywhere, every time you turn around, they were doing something new. Some lineages were like, all right, this works, I'm going to stick with it, and then persist it for millions of years. And rhizodonts did that. Coelacanths did that. A lot of the early amphibians did that. Some of them just got bigger, but they still kind of look the same. So yeah, so it's millions of years, and we do see that now.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. It's really cool that you met Romer.
I was just wondering, Jay, that was a great presentation. For the trees, and those are big trees. Those are tall trees, and you talk about cycles of flooding and dry periods with fires and stuff. Like that's a lot of flooding. What kind of time cycle are we talking about? Seasonal or millions of years of cycles, or that's a lot of for water to go up and down that much. At least
Yes.
in a short, what kind of cycle time are we talking about?
So on a smaller scale, we would see it seasonally. So you would have so it would be like you would have heavy rains, like kind of what you would see. It's like common like along the Nile, like on present time, and at some points in the Amazon, where you have like just huge amounts of rain, huge amounts of flooding, and then that goes down throughout the year, and then the cycle starts again. But then we would also see it on scales of millions of years, where the ocean would transgress onto land. And so you would have the marine environment, then it would start to regress, so recede away. And then you would switch from like a wetter human environment. And then towards the end, you would flip to like a drier environment as things started to dry out. And that was kind of happening all throughout the Carboniferous, this cycle, just as a result of what was happening worldwide. And then towards the end of the Carboniferous, when we started to get colder again and drier, these cycles sort of abated for a while.
So the longer term cycles, are they due to changing global temperatures and ice forming and melting, or
Oh,
what's
yeah.
creating the larger
Yeah.
cycle?
Yeah, so yes, so it is the result of some glaciation and then the glaciers going away. It's yeah. And then it's also the result of shifting of like the position of Nova Scotia shifting as Pangea forms.
Oh, thanks.
Anybody else? Okay, I have another question.
Okay.
So you showed a track of, I think, some a millipede or some invertebrate across an area, and then diagonally another organism that walked. I forget what it was. It had 3 toes, probably an amphibian, I suppose.
Yeah.
So how does something like that fossilize and then show up as a layer now where we can see the track?
Yeah. So it's actually like pretty interesting. So so what happens is so like basically they would be walking across like a muddy like river edge, or like some like what you would do when you're walking along a beach, and then that quickly becomes covered, and other sediment. So all fossil trackways like this are what we call cast and mold fossils. So the trackway is the mold, and so you make an imprint, and then that fills up very quickly, and then you have 2 pieces that will eventually like break apart because it's a weak spot in the rock as it hardens and solidifies and lithifies. And then they'll eventually separate, and you'll have like the raised trackways, which is what you saw in the picture. And then you will have like the cast, which is the original like footprint left behind.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's really cool. Yeah.
It is.
And it's kind of like the same thing that we do with like when you do like a baby footprint and then it hardens. Like it's like that, but 300 million years old.
Right. But the tracks, the mud must dry out so that when it
Yes.
floods, it doesn't just wash it away.
Oh,
So
yes.
Yeah, okay. Neat.
Yeah, I think at Blue Beach, you can see raindrops that fell
Yes.
during that time. That's just fascinating to be able to
Yes.
see how they imprinted in the mud and then solidified.
Yeah, we have some of that at Joggins too, and we also
Thank
have
you.
some ripple marks from when it was an estuary and the sediment was rippling as the waves flowed through, and then it hardens, and yeah.
So here's another question. Sandra Barr, you may know that name. She was the geologist who talked about the first billion years in Nova Scotia. And at the end, she said something interesting, and that was, well, this is my interpretation of what happened. Other people may have different interpretations. So when it comes to the fossil record, like how much is interpretation and how much is something that, lots of people kind of agree about?
No, so I get it. So I think as an academic, that's like a really healthy way to look at it.
Right.
I had a mentor tell me when I was a PhD student, like, don't make this your whole life, because in 10 years, some student is going to come along and turn it all over again. Like, don't,
Right.
like, you can't like make it your whole personality, because it's never going to stick. So she's right. So this is our best interpretation for Joggins for now. Sort of anything that's like peer reviewed. So everything that I talked about research-wise has been peer reviewed, which means that, other experts in the field have said, yeah, that interpretation seems right based on what you know. but it's constantly changing. So of course, so for example, one of the things that that happened prior to 2015 where researchers would say that those scales I showed belonged to coelacanths, and that there was evidence for coelacanth at Joggins. There was definitely evidence for it. And then a fish researcher looked at everything in 2014, 2015, and published a paper that's like, these are not coelacanth. These are just some other like relative, but it's not coelacanth. And that changes how we talk about Joggins now, right? Because of course, so yeah, so they were not coelacanths. But then another fish researcher in 5 years might come and look at it again and be like, no, these are definitely coelacanths. So it's what we know with the knowledge we have. And as we come up with new ways to look at things, and as we have students with new points of view looking at things, our interpretation of the site, of course, will change with time. So yeah, so this is my best guess for what has occurred. And maybe next week a student will come along and tell me that everything I know is wrong. And
Yeah, and I think that's the fascinating thing about science.
yeah.
It is that what we know today is the best knowledge based on the evidence at hand. But as new evidence comes around, we may change our perspective. And I think that's why scientists are often quite willing to change their minds about something, which for the general public can be quite disconcerting at times, I think. Because,
Yes.
yeah, things change.
From a personal perspective, it's the best part of being a scientist.
Yeah.
But of course, from like a media perspective, like trying to sell us to people, we seem a little shifty, I think, when
Exactly, but that's the nature of it. So
yeah.
anyways, is there a last question? And if not, then I will thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. And I hope that you have many years of interesting and eye-opening research at Joggins.
Thank you.
Must be quite a treat to be there.
It is.
Yeah.
It's really nice to see this place that I visited a lot as a PhD student, and I visited as a researcher as a PhD student, and I visited as a visitor when I was, in university. It's really nice. So thank you. And it was such a delight to see you all, and thank you for tuning in so close to the holiday season. I know it's very busy.
Yes.
Well, I heard you on CBC
Oh,
when you were interviewed, and that's what gave me the incentive to call you and invite
oh,
you. And another
thank
thing
you.
that gave me that was the time I was at Joggins. We went on the longer tour, and the interpreter was so kind to a little boy who was there. I guess the little boy found one of those roots that you showed in your
Yeah.
picture, and he took the time to get down on his knees with the child and dissect out that root, which probably wouldn't be there a week or two later because of the tides. But
Yeah.
he just took the time, that the child appreciated the nature that was, or the history of the nature that was there.
Oh,
I
that
thought
makes me
it was
so happy.
wonderful.
Do you remember the interpreter's name?
Oh, that's many years ago.
Okay. No, that makes me really happy. I love hearing stories like that. We have a really great crew there, and we're all really hoping to just foster a love of the site the way we love it. So
Yeah, he was a
thank you.
local. He
Oh,
was
so it must have been Dana. Yeah.
that could be the name. Yes,
Yeah.
really great.
Oh, thank
It
you.
gave an indication of the kind of values that you give out there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Jade. That was a great talk, super fascinating and very clearly delivered. And thanks for joining us mid the holiday season, right before your birthday. Happy early birthday.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks everyone
Happy
for
birthday.
joining in. Happy holidays and
Yeah.
happy solstice.
Yes, happy holidays and happy solstice, everyone. And we'll see you in 2023. Good. Bye-bye.